My name is Marla Kessler. After nearly 20 years at VitaWell, my new manager looked me in the eye and said, "Honestly, I just don't like you." No warning. No reason. I was gutted, erased like I'd never mattered. But I didn't go quietly. I left with my name intact and exposed the truth she fought to bury. I hope you'll listen to the full story, how I stood up, spoke out, and walked away without losing myself. Then tell me, did I do the right thing? Would you have stayed silent or done what I did? Leave a comment. I'd really like to know what you think. I still remember that Monday morning, how the sunlight spilled through the east-facing window beside my desk, how the air smelled faintly of burnt coffee from the break room. There wasn't the faintest hint that, within 10 minutes, 2 decades of my life would be quietly swept aside like dust off a shelf. It was early fall in Indianapolis. The trees lining Monument Circle had just begun to turn, and traffic downtown moved with a sluggish rhythm of people not yet ready to face the cold. I'd gotten to work a bit earlier than usual, a habit I never really broke. Old school, I guess. That's what people used to call me, reliable, methodical, boring even. I never minded. VitaWell Analytics had been my home for 19 years and 11 months. That's longer than any of my marriages lasted, and I had two. I started back when reports were printed and filed in manila folders, when you could walk down the hallway and actually know who sat behind each door. But things changed fast after Elise took over. She came in from the Chicago branch. 35. Blonde, precise, the kind of woman who smiled without meaning it. In her first company-wide meeting, she wore a sleeveless black dress and heels that clicked like exclamation points with each step. "I'm here to bring fresh energy," she announced, standing in front of a sleek glass panel instead of the whiteboard we'd used for years. Efficiency. Innovation. A new kind of workplace culture. The room had gone quiet in a way that didn't feel respectful, more like anticipatory dread. I glanced around. A few of the younger analysts were nodding, eyes shining like they'd just been handed a backstage pass. The rest of us, well, we looked at each other like people bracing for an oncoming storm. Within 2 weeks, Elise had dismantled every collaborative structure we had. No more department-wide briefings. No more cross-check reviews. Instead, she introduced a new direct reporting system. Everything submitted straight to her through an internal platform she insisted was more agile. The irony? She rarely responded. At first, I kept my head down and did my work. I'd been through regime changes before. You learn to adapt. But then came the budget report for Q3, my report. I'd worked on it for weeks, running projections on elderly care programs, digging through policy updates, even staying late to make sure the visualizations were polished. When I saw the final version submitted to the board, my jaw clenched so hard it hurt. The numbers were there. The charts were mine. The narrative flow, mine. But the author? It wasn't me. It was Bryn Wallace, a new hire Elise brought from her old office. I thought maybe it was a clerical error. Maybe something got crossed in the system. So I marched, to Elise's office. She looked up from her desk like I'd interrupted a private meditation. I just noticed the board report. I began, careful to keep my voice level. It's the exact file I submitted. But someone else's name is on it. Elise didn't blink. "We work as a team here, Marla. I don't think the name really matters." I let that sit in the air for a beat. "I understand collaboration," I said. "But this wasn't a group effort. If someone else wants credit, they should also contribute." She smiled. Not warm. Not cruel. Just vacant. "Let's not get bogged down in details," she said. "Our focus is outcomes, not egos." I didn't trust myself to keep talking, so I turned and left. My ears were burning by the time I reached my desk, heart knocking against my ribs like it was trying to escape. That should have been the end of it. Swallow the insult, do your job, move on. That's what women like me have been taught to do, especially when we're past a certain age, when people start treating you like a slow-loading web page, tolerated but easily closed. I sat down, stared at the blinking cursor on my screen, and tried to catch my breath. That's when it came, the message. Anonymous. Just one line. sent through our internal chat system. Watch your back. She's done this before. You're not the first. I read it 3 times before the meaning sank in. I wasn't just overlooked. I was being erased. And Elise? She'd done it before. Suddenly, everything felt different. The fluorescent lights too harsh, the room too quiet, the keyboard under my fingers too cold. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it either. Instead, I opened a blank document and typed one line at the top. If I'm going out knowing exactly who I am. After that anonymous message, something in me switched. I started watching things a little closer, not obsessively, not like I was trying to catch someone doing something wrong, but with that quiet alertness you get when you know you're not imagining it. The shift was real. Bryn Wallace had only been with us for a few months, but somehow, she was already part of every major project Elise was spearheading. I'd walk past the small glass conference room and see Bryn in there, smiling, nodding, taking notes like her life depended on it. Meanwhile, my calendar started looking emptier by the week. No more invites to weekly strategy meetings. No more review requests. It was like I was vanishing bit by bit, responsibility by responsibility. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe Elise was just trying new methods. Maybe she thought the team needed fresh eyes. But even as I tried to believe that, I could feel the familiar dread inching in. That quiet question I hadn't had to ask myself in years. Am I the problem? Was I too slow? Too traditional? Too 56? That's a dangerous place to live in, that headspace. Once you start doubting your own relevance, it doesn't take long for everyone else to follow suit. One Friday afternoon, I left work early and walked a few blocks to Harbor Roast, a little brick cafe tucked between a law office and a florist. The kind of place that played jazz over the speakers and had real ceramic mugs instead of paper. It was where I used to meet Diane Whitcomb back when we both worked at VitaWell. Diane had been gone for almost 3 years. She took early retirement after being passed over for a project she basically built from the ground up. They gave it to someone younger, someone with a flashier degree and a bigger Instagram following. Diane left without a fight. Or at least that's how it looked from the outside. I saw her at the corner table, same seat she always took. Her gray hair was cut shorter now, and she had on one of those wide linen scarves that made her look like she'd just come back from some writer's retreat in Maine. She looked up, smiled, and waved me over. I sat down and, for a moment, we just looked at each other. No small talk. Just that quiet, knowing silence that only comes from 2 people who've survived similar storms. I got your message, I said. Diane nodded slowly. I thought it might be you. We sat there for the next hour. I told her about the report. The credit.
Bryn.
The meetings I wasn't being invited to. She listened without interrupting, her fingers wrapped around a chipped mug that said, "Grace takes time." When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, almost too gently, "It's not because you're out of touch, Marla. It's because you remember the difference between strategy and showmanship. That makes people like Elise uncomfortable." I stared at her, not sure if I wanted to cry or laugh. Don't let them convince you you're the problem just because you still believe in integrity. There was a long pause. Then Diane said something that made my stomach clench. Elise pulled the same stunt in Chicago. She erased 3 people before someone spoke up. Quietly, of course. No one wanted to cause drama. Management didn't investigate, they just moved her. That hit harder than I expected. So this wasn't just ambition. It was a pattern. A calculated one. I thought about that the whole walk back to my car. About the way Elise had smiled when she told me, names don't matter. About the way Bryn had slid into every important conversation without ever asking. Suddenly, I saw things for what they were, not a coincidence. Not a misunderstanding. A method. I pulled into my driveway that night with a knot in my chest. I sat there in the car with the engine off and the radio playing something soft, something wordless. My hands rested in my lap, and I thought about how many women I'd seen slowly edged out over the years. Not because they weren't capable, but because they were inconvenient. Because they took up space that someone younger, louder, more marketable wanted. I wasn't angry yet. Not really. I was just awake. I went inside, poured myself a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen table. The silence was loud, but it didn't scare me. Not this time. I opened my laptop and started making notes. Not accusations. Just facts. Dates. Emails. Timeline of edits. I saved it to a folder named Simply. If needed. The announcement hit my inbox like a stone dropped in still water. Strategic Performance Review. Thursday, 10 a.m., Board Conference Room. Presented by Bryn Wallace. I stared at it, rereading the subject line until the words blurred. I already knew what it meant, but I opened the file attached anyway. Slide after slide of charts, metrics, forecasts, every single number pulled from the report I had compiled over the past 3 weeks. Down to the formatting, even the phrasing in the titles. My name was nowhere on it. She was going to present my work, and Elise had signed off on it. I sat back in my chair, fingers hovering over the keyboard like they were waiting for some command from the rest of me. Anger hadn't arrived yet. It was something quieter than that, like watching someone quietly pick your name off a door and replace it with their own, pretending you were never there to begin with. That Thursday morning, I didn't say a word. I sat in the back corner of the glass-walled boardroom and watched Bryn step up to the screen in her navy blazer and glossy ponytail, delivering my analysis like she'd drummed it up in her sleep. Elise sat at the head of the table, nodding occasionally, hands folded like a woman utterly in control. There was no mention of my name. Not once. I waited until the room cleared out and Elise stood alone by the whiteboard, stacking papers into a leather folder. I walked in.
Calm. Steady.
I'd like a word. She didn't look surprised. Of course, she said, motioning to the chair across from her. I didn't sit. That report, I began, was mine. I worked those numbers, ran those models, structured that forecast. Bryn delivered it, but it was my work. Elise gave a small smile, like I'd said something almost sweet. Marla, this is a collaborative environment. The goal is the success of the company, not personal credit. Bryn communicated the data effectively. That's what matters. I kept my voice even. I'm not asking for applause. I'm asking for honesty. She closed her folder gently and stood up. Now we were eye to eye. If you want to stay relevant here, I suggest you focus less on getting credit and more on staying aligned with the direction we're moving in. Don't get caught up in small things. Small things. That was what she called my weeks of work. My years of experience. My name. I walked out without another word. My face felt hot. Not from embarrassment, no, that wasn't it anymore. It was something else. The realization that I was being erased in broad daylight. And everyone was pretending not to notice. Back at my desk, I opened my inbox. There were already thank you notes going to Bryn. Compliments. One from the CEO. I deleted them without reading more than the first line. I opened my files and started archiving. Quietly. Carefully. Email chains, drafts, timestamps. I saved everything to a separate drive, labeled it clearly. No anger in the folder names. No theatrics. Just truth. That evening, I called Diane. She didn't even say hello. She did it again, didn't she? I let out a dry laugh. She didn't even blink. Diane paused. Don't react out of fury, Marla. That's what she wants. You do that and she gets to call you emotional. Unstable. She wins that way. So what do I do instead? You act for the record. Not for revenge. You make sure that if someone ever asks what really happened, the truth is sitting there. Clear as daylight. Her voice softened. And then you leave before they push you. That way, you don't lose a thing you didn't choose to give. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I sat in my living room with a notepad and started listing everything Elise had shifted, moved, distorted since the day she arrived. Not just my work, others too. People who had been sidelined, silenced, transferred. I'd been around long enough to know how patterns look when no one wants to call them what they are. Maybe I wasn't ready to call it a war yet. But I sure as hell wasn't going to be a casualty. Not quietly. Not again. It was a little after 6:50 on a Tuesday evening. The kind of hour where the office hums with a strange, hollow stillness, too late for work chatter, too early for the cleaning crew. I was one of the last lights still on, a small glow in a sea of empty cubicles. My back ached from sitting too long. I'd been combing through an old audit packet. Nothing urgent, just something to keep my mind occupied. I didn't want to go home yet. Home meant thinking. Thinking meant feeling. And lately I'd been trying to do less of both. That's when the message popped up in the corner of my screen. I blinked at it. James Tucker. I almost didn't click it. James wasn't the type to message people, especially not me. Fresh out of Purdue, quiet as a snowfall, always neatly dressed in those stiff-collared shirts that made him look like he still wasn't used to professional life. Nice kid. Smart. But not one to get involved. Still, I clicked. Elise told Bryn that making room for the next generation is something we have to do. She said you're part of the old system. That this is necessary change.
You don't deserve this, Marla.
Just thought you should know. I froze. Just for a second. Not because I didn't expect the sentiment. I've been feeling it in the air for weeks. The meetings I wasn't invited to, the credit I didn't receive, the way people started lowering their voices when I walked past. But James heard it
And chose to tell me.
That made it real in a way nothing else had. I read it again, slower this time, eyes moving over the phrase old system like it had teeth. Then my gaze landed on necessary change. God, how those words made my skin crawl. They always wrap it in strategy, don't they? Cutbacks becomes streamlining. Replacing people becomes realignment. And if you question it, you're not being adaptable. You're being emotional. Defensive. Stuck. I leaned back in my chair, stared up at the ceiling. The tiles had that cheap, chalky texture you see in every corporate office from here to Topeka. I followed the grid lines with my eyes, breathing slow. I didn't reply to James. I didn't need to. Instead, I shut my laptop, gathered my coat, and walked out without telling anyone goodbye. The parking lot was slick from a soft rain that had passed earlier. I didn't head to my car. I walked. Slow, steady steps through the side streets, listening to the quiet splash of puddles under my shoes. The cold air sobered me. I didn't cry.
Not yet.
But the ache in my chest was loud. By the time I reached my front steps, the street was dark, the porch light flickering like it couldn't make up its mind. I sat on the edge of my bed in silence. Still in my work pants. Still holding a mug of tea I'd warmed an hour earlier. It was lukewarm now, forgotten.
Like me.
I looked out the window, where the trees swayed gently under the weight of winter. My hands curled tighter around the mug. God, I whispered, not out loud, not exactly. More like inside, somewhere quiet. If I have to leave this place, let me do it clean. No bitterness. Just let me go with my name still whole. I wasn't asking for justice. I just didn't want to carry poison with me when I left. That night, I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. My fingers moved before my thoughts fully formed. I started collecting everything I'd noticed. The deleted credits. The reassigned charts. The subtle, quiet shifts Elise made when she thought no one was paying attention. No commentary. No rants. Just raw evidence. Labeled. Ordered. Chronological. When I was done, I printed it out. Bound it neatly. Slid it into the same drawer that held my passport, tax returns, and the deed to the house. It belonged there, with things that proved who I was. Then I opened a blank Word document and stared at the blinking cursor. It took me a while to start. But once I did, the words came easily. They weren't angry. They weren't even sad. They were honest. I've spent my career believing that transparency is not an option, it's a responsibility. Sometimes organizations grow in directions that no longer match the values we once held. And when that happens, we have to decide whether we bend to fit or choose to leave with what still matters. I didn't sign it yet.
Didn't send it.
But by the time I hit save, I felt something inside me settle. Not peace. Not yet. But steadiness. The next morning, I passed James in the break room.
He didn't speak.
Just nodded once, quick, almost shy, and poured his coffee like nothing had happened. but I held that nod like a lifeline. It told me I wasn't crazy. I wasn't alone. It was a Wednesday morning. The kind of morning where the air outside carried a sharpness that slipped into your coat collar no matter how tight you pulled it. I'd barely set my bag down when I saw the meeting request pop into my inbox. Elise Rankin, 9:30 a.m., Executive Office. No subject line. No context. Just a calendar block sitting there like a waiting room you didn't want to enter. I didn't bother asking what it was about. I knew. At 9:28, I walked her office. The hallway leading up to it always felt longer than it was, like the carpet absorbed sound and time equally. The glass door to her office reflected my face before she even saw me. Lips pressed tight, shoulders squared like I'd practiced in front of a mirror. She looked up when I entered. That smooth, neutral smile she wore like foundation was already in place.
Marla, she said.
Come in. Her voice was light, almost pleasant. Almost. But underneath the practiced warmth was a tightness. Controlled. Choreographed. There was always something about Elise that felt rehearsed. Her office was spotless, as usual. 2 glass walls, a white desk without so much as a smudge, and a chair that looked too modern to be comfortable. There were no personal photos, no plants, no hint that a person with a beating heart actually worked there. She gestured to the chair in front of her desk. I didn't sit. I stood with my hands gently folded, my bag still over one shoulder. My heart pounded so hard I thought I could hear it echoing off the glass. But I kept my face still. She didn't waste time. We're going through a structural adjustment, she said, folding her hands like she was opening a prayer. And after reviewing performance alignment across departments, we've concluded that your position no longer fits the direction we're moving in. Each word was polished like glass. Cold. Smooth. Impersonal. I said nothing. She continued, tone dipped in what I guess she thought was empathy. You have the option of stepping down voluntarily. That way, your benefits remain intact and your departure remains clean. I thought you'd appreciate the dignity of that option.
Dignity.
That word hit me harder than anything else. She was offering me dignity, like a consolation prize. Like a parting gift wrapped in fake politeness. I felt the back of my throat tighten, but I didn't speak. My silence filled the space between us like fog. And then she leaned back in her chair, voice lowering, shifting into something that was supposed to feel sincere. If I'm being honest, Marla, I just don't like you. You carry this old weight. This sense of entitlement that makes people uncomfortable. You've been here too long. You're not adaptable. The room went still. I blinked slowly. Not in disbelief, no. I'd seen this coming for weeks. What got me wasn't the message. It was the way she delivered it.
Calm.
Calculated. Like she'd been waiting to say those words for a while and finally found the right moment to unwrap them. She wasn't firing me because of a performance issue or a process change. She just wanted me gone. And she didn't think I had the strength to walk away on my own. What Elise didn't know, what she never bothered to learn, was that I hadn't made it this far by accident. I hadn't survived 2 decades of shifting policies, shrinking budgets, and short-sighted managers by being fragile. I reached into my bag and pulled out the black folder I'd put together the night before. I didn't rush. I placed it carefully on the corner of her desk like I was delivering something sacred. Inside were printed emails, metadata records, and copies of performance contributions she'd erased. Each page marked, time-stamped, and quiet in its clarity. Her eyebrows lifted, just a hair. I said, voice steady. If I'm leaving, I should clean up after myself, including the things that don't belong to me. She opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the first page. I saw it then, that flicker. It wasn't panic exactly. Not yet. But it was close. A pause in her breath. A tightening of her mouth. Her fingers stilled. The rhythm she used to control the room suddenly interrupted. I turned toward the door. Marla, she called. I stopped, hand resting on the doorframe. Yes. Are you planning to send that somewhere? I looked over my shoulder and shrugged. I haven't decided. Then I walked out. The hallway seemed quieter than usual. The hum of the copier. A distant laugh from someone near the break room. The same sounds I'd heard every day, but now they felt muted, like background noise in a scene that wasn't mine anymore. But I felt something strange as I walked. Not rage. Not even sadness. Relief. Because in that moment, I realized something Elise would never understand. The real loss wasn't being pushed out of a job. The real loss would have been staying silent, shrinking myself, pretending this kind of treatment was normal just because it was familiar. I didn't win her game, but I walked away with something she would never have. My name, my record, my truth. And sometimes that's the loudest kind of justice there is.
I didn't sleep much that night.
But not in the way you lose sleep over panic or dread. There were no spirals, no racing thoughts. Just stillness. Like the kind that comes after a heavy snow, the kind that blankets everything so completely, even the sound of your own breath feels like too much. I lay in bed, eyes open, listening to the radiator clink as it cooled. My thoughts weren't loud. They were settled, solid. By morning I knew. This was the day. The sky outside was a sheet of unbroken gray, and the air had that heavy, almost metallic taste that told you rain wasn't far behind. I dressed in quiet layers, slacks, a navy blouse, the silver necklace my daughter gave me last Christmas. Nothing flashy.
Just me.
I walked into the building like I had 100 times before, smiled at the receptionist, nodded to the guy from facilities, wheeling a cart of printer paper. Even managed to mutter a casual morning to Bryn in the hallway. She avoided my eyes. At my desk, I sat for a moment, just breathed. I looked around, not to say goodbye, but to remember what it had felt like when this place still belonged to me. Then I opened the draft I'd started a few days earlier. The cursor blinked at the top of the page like it had been waiting for me. The subject line had been empty. I filled it in now. Thank you, and moving forward. I read the body of the email again. Every line still felt true. I've always believed that integrity and clarity should never be considered luxuries in a workplace. We are stewards of the systems we inherit, and when those systems drift too far from transparency, it's our responsibility to ask whether the drift serves progress or just convenience. I paused, then added one last line before closing. To those who keep doing the quiet, right work, thank you. That spirit is what kept me here for nearly 20 years. No attachments. No folder links. Just my voice. Plain, deliberate, and steady. I hit send. And with it, something left my chest. Something that had been weighing on me for longer than I realized. I stood up, walked to the window, and stared out over the street below. The cars moved slowly, tires slick against the pavement, as the first hints of rain began to fall. The sky sagged, heavy with everything it was about to release. It didn't take long. First it was Anna from the finance team, early 30s, sharp, always too busy for eye contact. She appeared beside my desk like she wasn't sure if she should speak.
That email, she said softly. It was honest.
Thank you for writing it. A lot of us feel like that. But no one ever says it. I gave her a small smile. Sometimes you don't need to say it loud. You just need to say it clear. Then came Ryan, one of the junior analysts, his voice barely above a whisper. That was brave, he said. I didn't feel brave. I felt responsible. Before I shut down my computer, I glanced across the room and caught sight of James. He didn't wave, didn't smile. He just looked up, nodded once, slow and deliberate. I nodded back. No words were necessary. That kind of respect doesn't need to be spoken. It just stands. Of course, Elise wasn't going to take it quietly. By noon, she had already called HR, tried to frame my message as disruptive and inflammatory, spinning it as an attack on leadership. I heard from a friend in operations that she'd even reached out to 2 board members, trying to get ahead of whatever fallout she imagined might come. But Elise didn't realize something important. The people who value order don't always make noise. But they notice. And when they do act, they do it with precision. That's how I knew the email I received that afternoon meant something. It was from Charles Barnett. We hadn't spoken in years, not since we worked together during a state compliance overhaul. Charles was old school, One of those quiet men who believed in balance sheets, not branding decks. But he had always respected the data and, more importantly, the people behind it. His message was brief. Marla, your note reached me. I'd like to revisit some recent data handling reports. Can you direct me to where they're stored? I leaned back in my chair, reading it twice. This wasn't a courtesy email. This was Charles getting ready to dig. And Elise? She didn't know it yet, but the narrative she thought she'd sealed shut was already starting to unspool, slowly, methodically, and in all the places she least expected.
I didn't shout.
I didn't make a scene, but I'd said what needed to be said. And it turns out, when the truth is quiet and undeniable, people lean in to listen. Exactly 7 days had passed since I sent that email. And just like water pressing quietly against the banks, the ripples finally started to surge. It began with whispers. A closed-door board meeting. A sudden request from the Audit and Ethics Committee for Elise to submit a full review of her department's decisions, everything from budget reallocations to staff restructuring. HR, as always, kept things sterile and vague, but you could feel the shift in the air. Something was moving beneath the surface. People walked a little faster. Eye contact got shorter. And then came the leak. Someone forwarded a chain of internal emails. They didn't say where it came from, but it wasn't hard to trace. Elise had greenlit deep cuts to the Elderly Care Analytics Program, slashed staff hours, shelved 2 long-term research initiatives, then redirected those funds to a pilot innovation initiative. According to the metadata, the vendor running that initiative was a small consulting group. A group owned by her brother-in-law. There it was. The crack in the dam. The next morning, Diane messaged me. They're going after her policies now. Barnett's pushing it forward. Stay calm. Stay smart. I stared at the screen, then slowly nodded to myself. It was happening just like she said it would. By early afternoon, I got the calendar invite from Elise. Subject: quick touch base, clarifying recent communications. Location: Glass U Meeting Room, 4th floor. Time: 4 p.m. The phrasing made me laugh under my breath. Clarifying. That was her favorite tactic, make it sound neutral, mutual, professional. Like we were 2 old colleagues just ironing out a harmless miscommunication. At 4:01, I stepped into the Glass U room. It was freezing. The vents overhead pushed out air that smelled faintly of metal and lemon cleaner. Elise was already there, seated near the far end of a table. Her posture was immaculate, hands folded like she was waiting for a deposition, not a conversation. On the table were 2 white ceramic mugs. Only one was steaming. "Thanks for coming," she said with a soft smile. I didn't sit. "I thought it might be helpful to align perspectives before things escalate," she said, gesturing slightly with her hand, her voice calm but overly measured. "We're both women in leadership. I'd hate to see this turn into something unnecessarily damaging for either of us." There it was. The pivot. The appeal to sisterhood. The quiet implication that I was threatening some invisible bond by not keeping this quiet. I let the silence sit. I didn't fill it. I let her stew in it just long enough to shift in her seat. Then I said, quietly but clearly, "I'm not here because we're both women, Elise. I'm here because I spent 20 years working with integrity. Because I cleaned the data. Because I held the line when it would have been easier not to." She opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. Not with force, just a quiet signal that I wasn't finished. "And you? You saw someone who wasn't shiny. Someone who didn't play politics. You saw someone seasoned, and instead of valuing that, you labeled it as obsolete. You wanted loyalty, but only if it came with silence. That's not leadership. That's manipulation." Her jaw tightened. For the first time, the mask slipped just enough to see the edge beneath it. "I made strategic decisions," she said stiffly. "Every leader does. Sometimes we have to reassign. Sometimes we have to restructure." "You called me dead weight," I said flatly. "You erased my name from the systems I helped build. You handed my work to someone else and told them to smile for the cameras. And now you want to pretend it's just business?" She looked down, exhaled sharply through her nose. Her next words were brittle. This doesn't have to go further. It already has, I replied. I reached into my bag and pulled out a plain manila envelope. No markings. Just quiet, thick weight. I placed it on the table between us. Inside, documented financial redirection patterns, screenshots of communications, vendor listings tied to her family, the full scope of what she thought she could bury. I've already submitted this to the board and legal, I said, not coldly, just plainly. This one's just a courtesy. She didn't touch it.
Didn't say, thank you.
Didn't say anything. So I turned and walked out. My steps were deliberate, my heels echoing slightly against the polished floor. I didn't rush. I wanted every inch of that hallway to remember me walking it with my spine straight. In the elevator, I didn't press the button immediately. I stood for a moment, watching my reflection in the steel panel. Not younger, not triumphant, but whole. Outside, the wind had picked up. The leaves danced along the sidewalk like they didn't care who was watching. The sky above the city was clear, cut glass blue with the faint orange edge of evening rolling in. I turned back once, just for a second. The 14th floor caught the sun just right. A glint of glass. My desk, what used to be my desk, was somewhere behind that glare. I didn't wave. I didn't linger. Instead, I whispered to myself, steady as a stone. I didn't win their game. But I didn't become what they hoped I would, either. And with that, I walked toward whatever came next, lighter than I'd felt in years. It was late January, cold enough that your breath hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. I was back at Harbor Roast, the same cafe where Diane and I had sat not so long ago, when everything still felt uncertain. I had my usual, black coffee, no sugar, and my old leather notebook, worn at the corners, open beside a purple Pilot pen that had outlasted 3 laptops. The same corner table. The same window with a small crack near the bottom edge, where the cold crept in just enough to remind you winter hadn't finished with you yet. Outside, the street was gray and quiet, salt crunching under the shoes of people bundled in coats and hurrying nowhere fast. It had been exactly 1 month since I walked out of VitaWell for the last time. I hadn't gone back. Not even to visit. I didn't need to. News travels in places like that, even without a whisper. Elise had been suspended, pending a full internal audit. Word was that the board found more than just questionable budgeting. Turns out, when you start pulling one thread, the rest of the fabric doesn't always hold. The reallocation of funds. The lack of disclosure about her brother-in-law's involvement. The pressure she'd put on staff to rewrite reports. All of it surfaced, piece by piece, and this time, no one rushed to cover for her. I hadn't said anything publicly. I didn't need to. My part was already done. And then, 2 days ago, I got an email. It was from the Indiana Center for Elder Advocacy, a nonprofit that oversees ethical practices in long-term care reporting. Years ago, one of my audit studies had helped them flag a major flaw in state reporting. Apparently, someone on their board had read my farewell message from VitaWell and put 2 and 2 together. They asked if I'd be willing to consult. Nothing full-time, nothing high-pressure. Just review their data practices, offer insights, help them build something better. They didn't dangle money or prestige. They offered something far more valuable: trust. They trusted my judgment, my integrity, my experience. That offer meant more to me than any corporate promotion I'd ever been passed over for. Later that same evening, Diane called. Her voice came through the line soft and certain.
You did it, Marla, she said.
You walked through the fire and you didn't come out smelling like smoke. I let out a shaky laugh. I didn't win anything, though. You didn't burn, she said gently. And you didn't become like them. That's winning. After we hung up, I sat alone in my kitchen, flipping through my old notebooks. I found one I hadn't touched since the night I was let go. On the inside cover, in small handwriting, I had written, Lord, if I must walk away, please let me walk without shame. I stared at those words for a long time, then uncapped my pen and added beneath them, I walked. And I now know, the truth doesn't need to run. It just needs to stand. Back at Harbor Roast, I finished my coffee slowly. I didn't rush. I didn't need to be
Anywhere.
I saw two former coworkers walk by the window. They didn't see me. One of them was carrying a printed report, one I recognized. It was a model I'd built over 5 years ago.
Still being used. Still doing its job.
VitaWell never issued a public apology. No one called to make amends. That wasn't surprising. But quietly, the culture had shifted. People who had once avoided my eyes in meetings were now quoting my work, citing my standards. The ones who once said I was too rigid had started copying the structure of my reports. Elise's name had been removed from the directory. Her title dissolved.
But mine?
Mine was still on the footnotes of more systems than they realized. I packed up my notebook, left a tip on the table, and stood up. The cold hit my face as I stepped outside, but it didn't bother me. I looked up toward the direction of the VitaWell building, just for a moment. Not with resentment, just remembrance. Then I turned away. And as I walked down the block, I said softly to myself, not for anyone else to hear. I didn't need them to tell me I was right. I just needed to know I wasn't wrong. And I didn't stay silent. That was enough. More than enough. Maybe you've been there too, quietly watching a place you once gave your best to slip away, realizing that staying would mean losing more than just a job. I didn't leave to prove a point. I left to protect the part of myself that still believes in fairness, in truth, in showing up fully, or not at all. And maybe that's what this was really about, not fighting back but choosing not to disappear. Have you ever had to walk away from something that no longer saw your worth? If you have, I hope you know you're not alone. And you were never wrong for wanting respect. If this story found its way into a quiet part of your heart, I'd be honored to have you join me again next time. Until then, take care of that part of you that still knows who you are.